Hello, New Testament Survey folks. We're looking today at Ephesians and Colossians. They're often treated together when looked at in scholarship because they're very similar. We're going to talk about, just kind of briefly, kind of introduction to the actual text as far as some similarities between two letters. We're going to talk about authorship a little bit. And we're going to talk about the household codes in chapter 5 of Ephesians and 6 and 3 and 4 of Colossians. A little bit about culture and stuff. But let's kind of look at some of the commonalities between the two letters. Both of them are written from prison. Paul writes them from prison. There's a reference in Ephesians 3:1, Ephesians 4:1, Ephesians 6:20, Colossians 4:3, Colossians 4:10, Colossians 4:18 about Paul being in prison. Tychicus delivers both. Ephesians chapter 6:21 through 22 mentions that. Colossians 4:7 through 9 mentions that. And there's shared style by both letters. And they seem to be a little more elaborate than the rest of the Pauline corpus. There's numerous relative clauses, parallel expressions, genitival constructions. In Greek, there's the genitive case. Well, there's similar type things in English, but they're labeled genitive explicitly in Greek. These seem to be more so used in Ephesians and Colossians than the rest of the Pauline corpus, and that kind of gives us some hints about authorship, possibly. And a lot of the content is very similar and sometimes in the same order. So with that in mind, let's look at the right side of the screen to Table 1. This is Charles Talbert's commentary, Ephesians and Colossians. And I got to rave about Dr. Talbert. He taught for a good many years at Wake Forest University. Good, gracious scholar of a man. Ended his career at Baylor University, and I got to meet him several times. Very friendly, very courteous. Such a gentleman and a scholar, good churchman and a scholar. In fact, I think he even had at one point a daughter who lived in Lake Norman area. So he has a lot of connections still with North Carolina. Anyway, his work is scholarly, but it's spot on. Good, by the way, good commentary on Revelation, book Revelation. It's a little small, thin volume, wrote years ago. But anyway, Table 1. Note some of the similar passages in Ephesians 1 and Colossians 1. Ephesians 3, Colossians 1. These are very similar passages, and Talbert also has a comparative ordering, if my computer will work. I don't have enough memory, so I think sometimes whenever I run this Bible program and the recording, it bogs everything down. But anyway, there's a lot of passages that parallel as far as order and parallel as far as content. But they don't, even though they have some similar content, they don't agree in order about 40% of the time. Excuse me. And then sometimes the common material is developed in different ways. For example, in Colossians, Christ is the creator of the cosmos, Colossians 1:15 through 17. In Ephesians, he's the creator of cosmos in 3:9, while Christ is the creator of the new humanity in 2:15. In Colossians, God's fullness fills Christ first, then the church. That's chapter 1:19, 2:9 through 10. In Ephesians, Christ fills the church in all things. Chapter 1:22 to 23. Chapter 3:19, 4:10. In Colossians, Christ is the mystery. 1:26 through 27, 2:2, 4:3. In Ephesians, God's plan is the mystery. 1 verse 9, 3 through 4, 6:19. There's various other things going on here, and I'm trying to get this to scroll down. So forgive me as I try to get scrolling and look at my notes too. So there's some similarities, some differences, and there's all these different little passages that are very similar in order and content. But let's talk about authorship first. There's different options. First, authorship, as far as the word authorship, I put in air quotes. You can't see me doing the air quotes with my fingers. Authorship can mean the authors wrote a work by their own hand. And we have Galatians. Paul writes, "See what letters I write my own hand." Galatians 6:11. We've talked about a little bit about this with an issue of the amanuensis in these lectures. I believe I mentioned it more so in the Galatians Romans lecture. A second, it could be that the authorship could be the author dictated the writing. We find that in Romans 16:22 with mention of Tertius. A third option is the collaborators could have functioned as co-authors. You find in 1 Timothy 1:1, Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy. and several other places in like 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Philemon, Colossians, 2 Thessalonians, and Philippians. Fourth, another authorship option is someone could have authorized the writing and caused it to be written. John 19:19 says, thus the NRSV translates wrote as had written. Pilate also had an inscription written and put on the cross. He commissioned that writing. A fifth option is that the piece could have been written as if it were written by that person. Put in that person's voice. And I'm trying to get down, let me just see if I can go to the page number here, to something in Talbert's book that describes different modes of authorship and illustrations from Cicero. Cicero was a philosopher, and this thing ain't working. Anyway, and what I just went over, here it is. These different options: authorship by written in one hand, letters to Atticus from Cicero. I do not think you ever before read a letter of mine that I had not written myself. The authorship as dictation. The bare fact that my letter is by the hand of a secretary will show you how busy I am. Authorship is collaboration in writing. For my part, I've gathered from your letters both that which you wrote in conjunction with others, and the one I wrote in my own in your own name, or when you wrote in your own name, what I saw myself too. Authorship is authorizing someone. If there are any people to whom you think that the letters ought to be delivered in my name, pray compose them and see them delivered. And the writing as if by another author. Good, but good heavens, what credit I've given you in his eyes. I read him the letter, not by you, but by your amanuensis. So somebody writing in the person's stead, as if in their voice. So this comes into play when looking at, well, the sixth option, of course, is not written on here, but the sixth option is to just write downright forgeries. Pseudepigraphas, if you will, pseudepigraphic writings where they're written in somebody's name and passed off as being their own, being written later maybe. In fact, in 2 Thessalonians 2:2 says, do not be shaken or alarmed by a letter as though from us that says the day of the Lord has already come. So there's some forgeries even back then. But there's some reasons to think that the fifth type of writing here, the as if, the Deutero-Pauline nature, if you part of the corpus, is where Colossians and Ephesians fit in. So there's reasons to think that Colossians and Ephesians fit in this Deutero-Pauline corpus, if you will, written as the fifth type of as if authorship. And it's largely due to their theology. Now, some of it is grammatical construction, like I mentioned, relative clauses are different than most other Pauline corpus, the gentival constructions, things like that. But their theology is different. One of the issues is, for Paul, baptism is dying with Christ and resurrection is the future. That's Romans 6. But in Colossians, baptism is being buried and rising with Christ. Colossians 2:12, 3:1, 3:3. For Ephesians, baptism is the raising of those who were dead through trespasses and sins in 2:5. So that's a little bit of a difference. For Paul, mystery refers to an eschatological teaching about the participation of believers in the glory of the world to come. Romans 11:25, 1 Corinthians 2:6, 1 Corinthians 15:51. But for Colossians, the mystery of Christ in Ephesians is God's plan to reunify the cosmos, which involves inclusion of Gentiles into God's people. And that, Colossians 1:27, 2:3, 4:3, Ephesians 1:9 through 10, and 3:3 through 6. Another issue is for Paul, church. The word church refers to a local congregation. 1 Corinthians 1:2, 2 Corinthians 1:1, Galatians 1:22, 1 Thessalonians 1:1, Philemon 2. But for Colossians, the church is both local and universal. So it's not just a local individual congregation, but the church is a big C church. Like, my local congregation I'm serving currently is one church, but there's the greater church, the big C church, the churches in our community. And one example is Colossians 3:3 through 4. For Ephesians, the church is always universal. And that's, Ephesians 4:12 through 13 is an example of this. A fourth issue, Paul occasionally refers to Satan. 1 Corinthians 5:5, 2 Corinthians 2:12, 1 Thessalonians 3:5. But in Colossians, the leader of the forces of evil is the authority of darkness, 113. His legions are the stoicheia of the cosmos, 2:8 and 2:20. The rulers and authorities, 2:10, 2:15. And Christians have died to these powers in 2:20. In Ephesians, the enemy is the devil, 4:27. The ruler of the power of the air, 2:2. The host of evil spirits that dwell in the heavens, 2:2, 6:12. So there's a little bit of a difference of nuance going on between the Pauline writings and Colossians and Ephesians. Fifth thing, Colossians and Ephesians lack characteristic Pauline terms like sin, law, promise, righteousness, and justification. Nothing is said about the victory over sin, law, and death. The stress is on Christ's triumph in the cosmos. And that could be a contextual thing depending on the different various congregations, which, by the way, if you look on the left side on the coast of modern-day Turkey, you'll find Ephesus and Colossae. That area, Colossae, is just a little bit more inland than Ephesus, but they're right not too far from each other in modern terms. The imminent eschatology we find in Paul's early writings is not in Colossians and Ephesians. That's a different characteristic. These differences may point to something a little different, but when we look at ancient sensibilities, ancient notions, it's as if maybe where it's as if writing in Paul's voice by an amanuensis during Paul's time, or maybe a later Christian, as some have said, is where these probably fit in. These letters would have been perceived as forgeries only if their ideas are presented not in a continuity of Paul's writing. So these letters do fit in with Paul's writing. They're a little bit of a difference of nuance, but they do fit in. So if it was written by an as-if type author, somebody that's, amanuensis is authorized to write in Paul's voice, writing as if he were Paul. Since there's some continuity here with theology, this is not necessarily considered a forgery, even maybe if Paul didn't necessarily authorize it. Trust me, there's a lot of this writing in other people's voices, or writing other people's names, or passing oneself off as a writer or something going on in Second Temple Judaism. We have the books of Enoch, testaments of various patriarchs being passed off as being authentically from those figures, or in those figures' times, that they were written much later, inspired by those figures. And those are pseudo-epigraphic writings. Those are false writings. These are not necessarily in that category now. These are Deutero-Pauline more so. A lot of scholars' consensus on that. But they're Deutero-Pauline in the sense that this is probably one of the letters where Paul had an amanuensis write it, we think. So yeah. Anyway, so that's one important part as far as looking at both the letters and the writings. And both these letters are written for occasional situations. Colossians is written as more probably a defense of against the problem of the Colossian philosophy. That's one thing going on, different issues going on in the church. But I want us to focus most of our time today on these differences, or at least similarities, with these household codes. Now, there are three sets of household codes we find in the New Testament. And these household codes, these Haushaltsstaffel material, German term there, they kind of set the order of how the house was supposed to run. Most of the, a lot of these, the ancient Greco-Roman culture, the house was the kind of the main hub, and there's a certain way the house should be run, orderliness of the house. Think, kind of stereotype of the nuclear family type stuff going on in modern America, maybe like the stereotype 50s America, which, it's a stereotype because it wasn't always true. But these household codes were not just Christian writings, but other writings as well, kind of showing how the house should run and how the family should look and things that should be done. But in the New Testament, we have Colossians 3:18 through 4:1, Ephesians 5:23 through 6:9, and in 1 Peter 2:18 through 3:6. And they cover some of the same type topics, but there are some differences and nuances. We're not going to look at 1 Peter so much today as Ephesians and Colossians, since that's our topic today. But I've got on both sides of the screen both sets of text, and one's NIV 84, one's NIV, so there's a little bit of translational differences here. But I want us to look at the first category are wives. Greco-Roman culture, for the most part, man married to a woman. A very patriarchal society, there's some egalitarian things going on, but it's a very patriarchal society where the husband was the head of the house. The wife was pretty much a baby maker, stayed home, helped raise children. She was property a lot of times. I mean, for most of history, Western history especially, women were property. You didn't marry for love. You married for contractual arrangements. You married for property. Think about this. You may have seen a movie or read stories about, kings marrying a princess from another land so as to cement an alliance or an allegiance. That's one of the things. If you guys got kids, think about the Frozen movies. Anna and Elsa, they're supposed, trying to get them married off so they can form alliances with, Weaselton, in the land. Anyway, so yeah, trying to form alliances. So marriage pretty much was a property type of thing. It wasn't for love. Keep that in mind as we look at this. So both passages start off, wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. So both passages have this notion of being subject to or submission. The Ephesians passage says as to the Lord. Colossians says as fitting in the Lord. It's a little bit of difference and nuance, but still this notion of what's appropriate, what's right for God. But it's a cultural thing too. This is in the cultural thing. This is Paul being culturally conservative for his day, not rocking the boat too much. Okay, because remember, these people had to live in possibly in cultures in places where if they rock the boat too much, that may bring some persecution, that may bring some hardship, however you want to define it. But notice the next verse. This is one of the kickers here. Now, my contention is in every one of these different settings, husband, wives, children, fathers, slaves, masters, there's a countercultural issue going on, as well as a supportive normal culture going on, a conservative versus a progressive type notion going on. So we look at verse 23 in Ephesians. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Okay. Notice we don't have that over in Colossians. It's a rather Spartan version of it. Now, verse 24 of Ephesians. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to the husbands in everything. So it has that bit of adage before it moves on to the husbands. Look over in Colossians, it goes straight from wives to husbands. Okay. Maybe in a different context going on. There's a little different nuance going on here. But notice that there's a notion of submission to Christ going on here. The Christ is the head of the church. Not so much that he's the boss, which he is, but not so much the head isn't necessarily the notion of a boss. The head is a notion of the source of life. One thing to keep in mind is our modern notions of a head and a heart are different than the notions of the New Testament era of a head and a heart. The heart was the place of rational thought, and the head was kind of like the place of emotion, kind of like thought of as in some ways, some cultures, the head was thought of as like the heart. It pumped the blood as a source of life. So Christ is the head of the church. He's He's a source of life for the church. In some ways, in the ancient culture, the husband was a source of life for the wife. Widows and orphans were considered often the lowest rungs of the society because they had no one really to care for them. So without a husband, a lot of times a woman lost her identity. A lot of times she didn't have much economic clout in the community, purpose, etc. A few exceptions here and there, but that's kind of the norm. But notice verse 25 in Ephesians and verse 19 in Colossians here. Husbands, love your wives. Okay, so that's common. There's a little bit of difference going on here with Ephesians and Colossians again. You have Colossians, a rather Spartan account. Love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Okay. Ephesians says, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any blemish, but holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated his own body, but he feeds and cares. Anyway, there's a lot of different things going on here, but essentially the big thing is that husbands are to love their wives. That's countercultural for the society of the day. Husbands weren't necessarily supposed to love their wives in marriage in Greco-Roman culture. There are some instances where they did, but this is I'm supposed to love my wife. Not only love the wife, but love as Christ loved the church and gave himself for the church. Christ sacrificed himself for the church, gave up himself. Go back to the Christ hymn in Philippians 2. That sacrifice notion is important. A husband is, in some ways, is kind of lowering himself. It's a leveling of the playing field here. Wives are supposed to submit to the husbands, but the husbands are also not be on the pedestal, but lower themselves and submit, and love their wives. So it's a leveling of the playing field in the culture in some degrees, some ways. The next group we get are the children and the fathers. Now again, Colossians is pretty Spartan, gives us the detail, and Ephesians gives a little more detail. But Ephesians 6 says, let's see. Yeah, Ephesians 6:1, children, obey your parents as in the Lord, for it is right, honor your father and mother, which is the commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and you may enjoy long life on the earth. Again, the only commandment with a promise is honor your father and mother. That is one of the bedrock notions in Judaism. The Ten Commandments are the bedrock notion, the basis of Judaism in some ways, but Paul appeals to that as a rationale. Or the person writing in Paul's name appeals to that. But of course, go over to Colossians, again, rather Spartan. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Either way, obeying your parents is what was expected of the child in a Greco-Roman culture and even a Jewish setting. Obey your parents. And a child was, and again, they were property. In the Greco-Roman world, there were instruction manuals on how to get rid of children if you didn't want them. If you didn't want a girl, you didn't want a child with a birth defect, you leave them out for exposure. Or a woman's pregnant and didn't want to be pregnant, there were instruction manuals on how to abort this child. Falling down steps, punching themselves in the stomach, things like that. Children were considered property. I mean, you look at, if you guys ever seen the movie The 300, not the most PG type movie, it's a little violent, but the Spartan child born with a birth defect, he was shunned from the community because of his birth defect. He wasn't wanted. Sanctity of life wasn't necessarily big in the vocabulary of the Greco-Roman world. So children, again, were property there to obey. But Paul writes something a little countercultural going on with the fathers. Colossians, fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. So again, don't beat them. Don't treat them poorly. Treat them a little respect. And that's something we take for granted in our culture today, but we live in the legacy of Paul in Greco-Roman, Greco-Roman world, we do live in the legacy of it, but we live up more so, and especially in the United States today, especially in the South, we live in the kind of a legacy of Judeo-Christian ethics, especially Christian notions of this text. Excuse me. Now, the next pairings are slaves and masters. Again, Colossians are rather Spartan, but let's give more so on slaves than it does on the other ones. Colossians says, 22, slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for the wrongs, and there is no favoritism. So, similar type thing going on over here with Ephesians. Obey them not only to win their favor with eyes on you, serve them single-heartedly, as if you're serving the Lord, not men, because your reward is the Lord reward everyone for whatever good he does, whether slave or free. So similar type things. There's a little more detail in Colossians going on here. But think about this. Slavery in the ancient context was different than modern slavery in American experience. You think slavery in the South, especially prior to the 1860s, and even modern day slavery. We find even going on in the States today, even though it's illegal. It's different in some ways in the slavery you'd find in the ancient Near East, you'd find in the Greco-Roman context. Slaves are still property, but a lot of times sometimes slaves are very numerous in some cities. A lot of times indentured servitude was more of a type of model that's akin to the modern notion of indentured servitude, is more of akin to what you'd find in the Greco-Roman world, where you'd work off a debt. People were sometimes lands were conquered, people were taken as slaves, and they were for the most part treated well. For the most part. Sometimes slaves would instruct the children, raise the children. A lot of teachers would be slaves, things like that. But again, Paul is being conservative with his culture, saying, slaves, obey your masters in everything, with fear and respect. Not just when they're looking, but when they're not looking, because it's God that's watching you. So Paul is very, very culturally conservative here. But the next set, the next person, that Paul addresses is a little bit of countercultural. Colossians, masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you also have a master in heaven. And Ephesians, masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven. There is no favoritism with him. So again, treating slaves fairly and right, and not threatening them, are both countercultural to what was expected of the day. Again, slaves are still property in the Greco-Roman world. They can still be treated poorly, treated with less standards than a citizen, for example. But Paul's saying respect them. And notice he appeals to God as well. God's a master over you, so remember that. So again, this household code is setting a household in order, but it's Paul giving a Christian perspective, or at least somebody writing in Paul's name, giving a Christian perspective on how a household should function in the Greco-Roman world. It's not just wives are property, husbands you're the boss, dads you're boss of children, slaves obey. It's responsibility given to the more responsible party, the higher up party, to give them more responsibility, kind of the leveling of the playing field to some degree. So countercultural and conservative at the same time. So not to rock the boat too much, but maybe just a little bit. Okay, New Testament survey. Let's look at the pastoral epistles now. The biggest thing I want to talk about is the issue of authorship, and these topics associated with authorship will give us a little bit of insight into the pastoral epistles. First off, the question is, what are the pastoral epistles? So there are 3 letters attributed to Paul, and you'll notice on the left side of the screen, which are addressed to Timothy, and 2 to Timothy, 1 to Titus. They're pastoral in the sense that they're sent to leaders of these local congregations. It's not to an individual church, it's not to a certain issue for the greater congregation as much as it is something to these leaders, Titus and Timothy. Most of these letters are put in the Deutero-Pauline canon, or set of the canon, or what people call not necessarily written by Paul's hand, because of some different things going on here, especially their contrast with texts like Romans and Corinthians letters that we more than likely think were attributed to Paul, or Paul wrote them in some way or form. So the first thing I want to talk about is some of these features that, question whether Paul wrote these or not, is a distinct vocabulary and style of the pastoral epistles. There's a high proportion of hapax legomena. Let me spell that as two words there. Hapax is H-A-P-A-X. Legomena is L-E-G-O-M-E-N-A. These essentially, this phrase means like words that recur only once in a letter. Like, most times our vocabulary is reflected in our writing. So our writing style, our grammar, our syntax, The way we talk a lot of times is reflected in how we write. So, for example, if I read a document, read something for one of my students, when you guys wrote a paper or something, and like I've had you write earlier in the semester, but I get this one document and it's like so much more polished, the language is so much higher. Or if I get to a section of paper and the vocabulary has changed, it's higher vocabulary, or the writing style, the syntax is a little more complex, that puts up red flags for me that maybe you didn't write it as a student, or these hapaxagomena are words that are only used maybe once in the New Testament. Style, kind of leaves a fingerprint upon the text, but there's these differences of style and hapaxagomena, etc., aren't necessarily just attributable to different subjects or different moods. The writer seems to be drawing from a different vocabulary pool, a different writing style, character, different perspectives. In fact, there's 175 hapaxagomenon in the pastoral epistle. Excuse me, 175, 131 in the pastorals that are not in the Pauline corpus. And there's also more of a Hellenistic type of style. Now, a second thing is the issue of the word faith. And I put air quotes. You can't see me do air quotes. Air quotes the word faith. By the time, which most people attribute the pastoral epistles to a later time period than Paul's earliest writings, even if Paul wrote it. But by this time, the term faith seems to be formalized into the faith. So it's not just believing in something as much as it is a set of rules, a rule of faith, if you will, by this notion of the faith. The mood in the pastorals is much less that of preaching the faith as opposed to preserving the faith. Not so much of evangelism as much as it is containment. There's faithful sayings, faithful things. The rule of faith, if you will, is something that is of note. And if I get my computer to work here, we'll look at 1 Timothy 1:15 as an example of these faithful sayings, 2 Timothy 1:9, 2 Timothy 2:11 through 13, Titus 3:4. For some reason my computer's not working. Anyway, so you guys get the point there, that there's this notion of a set of beliefs is the faith, more so as in believing things. Just belief, or even evangelism. And now one little caveat to that, Paul does use this notion of the faith referring to a body of beliefs in Philippians 1:27 and 2:7. But some scholars who date the pastorals later and date them Deutero-Pauline, what have you, they focus on the faith as being a set of codified beliefs or set of beliefs as opposed to just faith in Jesus, believing in Jesus. Yeah, and my computer's not cooperating, but anyway, it's a problem having a Surface tablet with a slower processor with there finally pops up with a program that takes a lot of memory. Anyway, 1 Timothy 1:15, here's a trustworthy saying, a faithful and true saying, kind of the Greek what points to there. Anyway, my computer's wigging out there, but anyway, you get the point. There's the faith. Now, a third thing that pops up is this notion of threats to the gospel seem to be different. Excuse me. Whereas the challenge of Jewish Christians, these Judaizers, runs through Paul's earlier correspondences like Romans or Corinthians, 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians, Galatians. All we hear through the pastoral epistles are best echoes of this dispute. Maybe 1 Timothy 1:7 or Titus 1:10. But the fact of the faithful sayings formula, truthful sayings or true sayings, may point to a polemical thrust against his audience. In other words, that there's an internal intra-church issue of theology or belief. Now that may have something to do with a Judaizer, but or somebody that's pointing to Judaism being the norm for which Christians have to go, but there seems to be something different here. With the precision with which Paul aims his counter thrust, whether in theology or even praxis action, in other words, the reader can think that there's a clear picture of the positions which Paul objective, but pastoral, there's really no precision there. It's just dismissive formulations that seem, as one commentary puts it, generates more heat than light. there seems to be intra-church disputes as opposed to an external group. So there's belief of faithful sayings, true sayings. Let's see here. Okay, and then, well, I get my computer to work there, get pulled up there. I apologize, guys. It's one of them things, right? I've gotten several emails from students in the past. I got computer issues. Well, guess what? Prof has them too. Anyway, the next issue is the church structure. Paul does mention a few things in some of his letters, like there's a mention of Phoebe being a deacon. That could be a church office. But there seems to be more of an issue of a formalized structure of the church as far as officers when the pastoral epistles were written. There's a bishop or an overseer. There's a deacon or a minister mentioned here. Elders are mentioned. You don't see these in some of the earliest writings because these weren't necessarily formal positions that had to arise out of need. Okay, so again, another reason why some scholars date the pastoral epistles to be later, maybe to a later author after Paul's death. Somebody writing as if they were Paul and Paul's line, and as if we talked about in the discussion of Ephesians and Colossians. But let's look at 1 Timothy 3 here and kind of talk about this notion of positions. Here's a trustworthy saying. It's on the right side of the screen if you'd like. Whoever aspires to be an overseer, a bishop, if you will, episkopos. Episcopalians have bishops, and Methodists have bishops. We Baptists, for the most part, don't. But this is more than likely is either an overseer in the sense of someone oversaw some churches, maybe an individual church. Desires a noble task. Whoever is an overseer is to be above reproach, faithful to his wife, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not given to drunkenness, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own family well and see his children obey him. He must do so in a manner worthy of full respect. And it goes on to give these different characteristics. He must not be a recent convert, may not be conceited, good reputation with outsiders. So there's this notion of virtues for this position, this what seems to be an established position of leadership within the congregation. Another position mentioned here is a deacon, a minister, if you will. We don't know if that's a deacon as far as like a Baptist church has lay leaders, or this is probably a deacon in the sense of a local person who ministers in the community that may have some sort of quasi-clergy role. But deacons are to be worthy of respect, sincere, not including much wine, not pursuing dishonest gain, and must hold the deep truths of the faith with a clear conscience. So again, another virtue list, if you will, for this deacon. Now, here's a little pop-up here. It says the word deacons refer to Christians designated to serve overseers and elders of the church in a variety of ways, and gives you a few examples there. But somebody that did ministry with the local parish, whether it's a high elevated status or what have you. But anyway, so these deacons, these overseers, these bishops are established offices that seem to be within the church, again pointing to a later date. There seemed to be some issue of the fifth issue here we talked about. Of course, the language and style, vocabulary of the pastoral epistles being different than Paul's letters. We talked about this notion of the faith versus faith. We talked about the outsiders, the threats. It seems to be more of an intra-church dispute as opposed to an outside external issue. We've talked about the fourth thing was the bishops and overseers of more established offices. The fifth thing about the pastoral epistles that kind of muddy the waters as far as Pauline authorship is this. There seem to be greater accommodations with the norms and structures of the contemporary society. There's not simply the readiness to accept the political structures of the day. Seems to be a little different here going on here. So let's look over at, if I can get this to work, Titus 3:1. Titus 3:1 and 1 Timothy 2:1 through 2 are often cited in this connection. There seems to be accommodation. Some going on here. Anyway, let's read here. Remind them to submit to the rulers and authorities, that they should be obedient and ready to do everything good. They shouldn't speak disrespectfully about anyone, but they should be peaceful, kind, and show complete courtesy toward everyone. We were once foolish, disobedient, deceived, and slaves to our desires and various pleasures too. We are spending our lives in evil behavior and jealousy. We are disgusting and hated other people. But when God, our Savior's kindness, loved and appeared, He saved us because of His mercy. So anyway, so there's this notion of a greater accommodation of the structures of society, a greater giving in, I guess you will, to the culture of the day. Unlike the present epistles, Paul's pastoral epistles, or excuse me, these pastoral epistles have nothing about reciprocity or equality. Paul seems to be a more conservative social stance in 1 Corinthians 6, 1 through 6, and Romans 13, 1 through 5. So this notion of there being more of an accommodation in Titus 3:1 and 1 Timothy 2, 1 through 2 isn't necessarily out of the norm of Paul, but some scholars cite this as being a different perspective. Now, a sixth thing that causes us to question the Pauline authorship of the pastoral epistles is something that has to do with the later copies of the New Testament. The New Testament was written down individually as books and eventually copied and passed on. Well, there's some of these copies, of course, didn't have Xerox machines, copy machines back then, so they used hand copies. In Papyrus 46 and also Marcion, the heretic Marcion, his canon, the pastoral epistles were not included in the Pauline material. So whenever these copyists organize stuff, P46 doesn't have the pastorals with Paul's material, has it separate, and so on with Marcion's canon. So there's some issues why people doubt Pauline authorship, but as we've discussed in previous lectures, talking about amanuensis, we talk about the different modes of authorship in the ancient world. These still could be quote unquote written by Paul, but not actually written by his hand. Paul's names are on the documents, but they could be pseudonymous. They could be written by somebody in the spirit of Paul, maybe somebody he's authorized, or maybe a student writing in his voice continuity. So again, the issue of plagiarism is different in the ancient world than it is today. If you guys wrote in the spirit of somebody else, I noticed it and I knew about it, then you would probably get a 0 on your paper for my face-to-face class. But in the ancient world, it wasn't necessarily that case. I would like to think this is a notion we talked about with Cicero. This is writing in the spirit of, or as if they were this person. Paul, maybe if anybody wrote it other than Paul, which Paul may have written these, may have authorized somebody, but writing in the spirit of that person, thus giving authority to giving credence to the text. So anyway, the pastoral epistles are these 3 different documents that are geared toward individuals, people who were leaders in their local congregations. But there's some things that cause scholars to think they weren't written by Paul. And of course, like I mentioned, there's the rule of faith, there's the language of vocabulary, there's the threats to the gospel, these insiders as opposed to outsiders. There's a degree of development of church structure with the different offices. There's greater accommodation to the normal structures of contemporary society. There's a notion that the pastorals are included in some Pauline materials in some copies. But like I said, again, that doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot when it comes to authorship in the ancient world. So there we go.